Okay, the subject of this video is materialism and idealism. Now, in popular culture, uh, ma- both of these terms have, a slightly different meaning than exists in philosophy. Philosophy has a more strict definition of these terms. The popular definitions are kind of related to the more strict definitions in philosophy, but they're not exactly the same. Um, for instance, materialism, um, in popular culture, we know it as loving material things, loving objects or furniture or cars or microwave oven, that kind of thing. We amass material things, a love of material goods, stuff. Um, if you're a materialist in that sense, then you kind of somebody who is a bit crass, maybe just likes amassing uh, objects. Um, in philosophy, materialism is, well, it's a theory of knowledge, which means an epistemology, a theory of knowledge about how we get knowledge. And this theory of knowledge says that we experience an independently existing world, a material world. We're part of this material world, but it affects us and it exists independently of whether we think about it or not. That's quite important. Um, okay, in philosophy, idealism has a different view of that. It thinks, in its theory of knowledge, that we experience what we think. In other words, that it's because we think that we experience things, or that the world exists as a product of our thinking, or a product of our human spirit, or our way of thinking. Now, idealism has its own sort of popular understanding, and this is what's idealism? It's that to be an idealist is to be a little bit believing in slightly crazy, wonderful things, being a bit utopian, looking on the bright side and very optimistic about everything. Um, Having beliefs that might not necessarily be able to be fulfilled in the future. That's what it is to be ideal. Um, we know that. But idealism in philosophy is different to that kind of idealism, but it might lead to that in some cases. Now, Marxism uh, is a materialist philosophy. It is a materialist epistemology, or it refers to a materialist epistemology. Uh, Remember, epistemology means a theory of knowledge. Its theory of knowledge is materialist, but it is not a sort of ordinary materialism. It's not a basic materialism. It doesn't just say that and that is all. It is a dialectical materialism, or a materialism that is interested in including the process of material development. The dialectic enables materialism to understand the process of change in material reality and the way you experience it. So it is controversial in Marxism. I mean, there are some Marxisms that are more materialist and they disregard the dialectic, especially today. The dialectic has a long history in philosophy and specifically in idealist philosophy. Um, but it can be described as the process of thesis, antithesis, or antithesis, yeah, and synthesis. So it's a bit like an argument. You put forward a thesis, something contradicts that thesis, so that becomes the antithesis, and then you have from these two opposing forces, arguments, you have a synthesis. But then that synthesis also contains another thesis and another antithesis, and the process continues. Okay, although materialism and idealism are kind of opposed to each other, they're opposing views. Um, they've had a long history in philosophy, and in that history, they have mutually, you could say, they've mutually benefited each other because one side learns off the other. And there are also many different variations of materialism and idealism, and there are shades that blend in and out. And so it's for instance, we could say that Hegel, who is a great idealist philosopher, um, also had a big influence on Marx, and therefore he contributed in a sense to materialism. Um, yes, and also say, for instance, Descartes, who is a great idealist philosopher, he contributed a lot to mathematics and scientific, the history of science in that sense. Now, it seems perhaps obvious, materialism historically has been more the philosophy of the sciences, and idealism more the philosophy of religion. That is not to say that idealist philosophy has always been the same thing as religion or necessarily mystical, but you could say that religion is like a very super idealism because it believes in God and extra mundane things. On the other hand, materialism hasn't always been completely sided with science, but it is, you could say, the spontaneous philosophy of scientists is to be more or less materialist in their outlook in relation to the world that they study and scientifically analyze. Yeah. So, okay, um, in that sense, Marxism is sees itself as scientific. It takes the scientific position. It presents itself as a science, economic science, science of history. It is interested in those things and taking that position. It is not religious. Yeah. Okay. Um, because Marxism takes the side of science, takes a position in science, not religion, not idealism, as a materialist, as a materialist in philosophy, a materialist philosophical position, as an epistemology in its theory of knowledge. Because of this, you could say that Marxism is not a humanist philosophy. Now, I want to try to define humanism and anti-humanism, because you could say Marxism is a kind of anti-humanism. Now, humanism and anti-humanism also has popular understandings, which are like the popular understandings of materialism and idealism, which are quite different from the strict sort of philosophical understanding. The popular understanding of humanism is, well, what is it? It's like, being nice, looking after people, caring, love. Um, Also, it's conflated or confused with or mixed up with humanitarianism, which is a different kind of thing. Humanism, but that happens in everyday life. Okay, so if you're a humanist, you're thought to believe in the human value of things. Anti-humanism has its popular version, which is especially today, which is often thought of as being anti the human being and maybe being pro animal and not interested in the human valuation of things, but in valuing nature and animals and creatures, other creatures. So they're anti the human, anti this human creature which seems to have kind of ruined the world or be in the process of ruining the world. So there's a kind of that variant of anti-humanism. Maybe it also verges onto a sort of nihilistic, deliberate hatred of human beings. But in philosophy, humanism and anti-humanism have more strict meanings. And humanism is a philosophy which has sort of existed since the Renaissance, or um, but I'll try and sum it up in a more modern sense. It relates definitely to the idea that the human being, um, separate from God, separate from religion, has a human spirit or a human essence. And this human essence um, has certain consequences for the way we think about reality and politics, life in general, which are sort of distinct from how religion first, used to order our lives. So humanism is a kind of relatively modern philosophy. When I say philosophy, it's not strictly philosophy, or as strict as the philosophical terms materialism and idealism, because humanism can also refer to sort of everyday ideologies, political ideologies. For instance, you might say the soft left is kind of humanist in the sense that it's like it believes in caring. It puts these values on things which are human values, and perhaps these come from the concept of a human spirit or a human essence. This human spirit and this human essence, this concept, um, then relates to another idea, which is the idea of the democratic Leviathan, or Hobbes' Leviathan, which is the sort of electorate understood as a universal people, or as a giant, a kind of giant, and when everybody comes together to elect in a democracy, um, they form a kind of giant person, a giant will, and this is the people, understood as the people. So this human essence is kind of embedded in this notion of the democratic people, the people as a universal. Um, so that's a kind of modern idea of humanism, and I would say Marxism is not a party to that humanism. Marxism is not a humanism. Marxism is a humanitarianism. It's interested in the well-being of people, but it is not a humanism in that sense. Or at least we would have to say Marx is not a humanist because he doesn't believe that this people as a universal exists. What actually exists for Marx is classes. Um, because of people's relationship, their different relationship to the means of production, to the mode of production, economic production. In capitalist society, there is no universal people. People relate to their employment differently. They have different economic relations to their employment. The majority of people are exploited, while a small number, a minority, are capitalists and they do the exploiting. So this means that there are at least two different classes, at least. And these classes um, make it really silly to be able to refer to a universal people. So that's one thing why Marx does not agree with the humanism in that sense. The other aspect is, obviously we've already mentioned, is the science. It is interested in science, and science has to put aside questions of human spirit and essence, and it is materialist. It is more materialist, and obviously humanism tends to be more idealist, and Marx is not idealist. Okay, so anti-humanism, in its more strict philosophical sense, is everything that humanism is not. So it opposes humanism. And I would say it probably arose as an opposition to humanism. So while it sees humanism as a sort of bringing God down to earth, but only to the level where it becomes the human spirit, um, anti-humanism would say that is not enough, that it should go further and criticize this human spirit and find out where that comes from. And if there is any, in fact, it would say that there isn't this human essence or this, what's another term for it? It would be human nature. It criticizes the idea of human nature as certain specific essences. So, so yes, anti-humanism is that kind of position in philosophy, and some philosophers such as Louis Althusser would be called an anti-humanist Marxist because he takes that position. He does not believe in this absolute subject, even when, such as God, I mean the subject with the capital S being God, being brought down to earth, but only to the extent where it becomes a human essence, and this essence contains very many similar things to the idea of God. So yes, it's the opposite of humanism, but it's not anti-humanitarian. It's obviously it still is interested in and cares about the fate of people, of human beings. On the other hand, it sets great store, a greater store in science and in being correct and understanding things in a way that's materialist rather than rather than going to the emotional and sentimental level, which perhaps humanism puts at the forefront. So it has to be said in the end that these concepts of essence, this idea of essence that humanism has, the human spirit, these ideas do lend themselves to this, to the ideologies, to these ideas of racial essence, gender, sexual essence, um, and these ideologies are quite in the worst manifestations are very, they're fascist. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you for watching this.